The Andes Mountains form a continuous wall along the western edge of South America. In central Chile and western Argentina, the range rises sharply, folding into ridges and valleys shaped by ice and wind over thousands of years. At elevations above 11,000 feet, vegetation disappears. What remains is rock, snow, and long stretches of exposed terrain where sound carries easily and movement is slow. In October, winter is loosening its hold at lower altitudes. In the high Andes, it has not yet released its grip. Snowfields remain deep. Temperatures fluctuate sharply between daylight and night. Wind moves without obstruction, stripping heat from anything exposed. Visibility can shift within minutes as clouds form against the slopes and spill into the valleys. The plateau where Flight 571 would come to rest sits between steep ridgelines, far from any established route. There are no settlements nearby, no permanent trails, and no infrastructure meant to support human presence. Even experienced mountaineers pass through such terrain quickly, aware that remaining in place carries risk. At this altitude, the body reacts slowly. Breathing becomes shallow. Movement requires more effort. Dehydration occurs even in cold conditions. Without shelter, the environment dictates the pace of survival. Days are shaped by light and shadow. Nights bring prolonged darkness and temperatures well below freezing. Search aircraft rarely fly low through these valleys. Weather patterns interfere with visibility, and snow absorbs sound and color. Wreckage blends into the landscape. From above, white metal and white ground are difficult to separate. This is a place that does not announce danger. It remains still. The threat comes from duration rather than immediacy. Time stretches differently in the mountains. Hours feel long. Days pass without markers. The environment offers no guidance and no reassurance. In October 1972, this terrain was empty. No one lived there. No one expected to remain there. What would unfold in this isolated section of the Andes would be shaped less by sudden violence than by prolonged exposure to a place never meant to sustain human life. Uruguayan Air Force Flight 571 departed Montevideo on October 12, 1972. The aircraft was a Fairchild FH-227D, a turboprop plane operated by the Uruguayan Air Force but used frequently for civilian charter flights. On board were 40 passengers and 5 crew members. Most of the passengers were members of the Old Christians Club, a rugby team traveling to Santiago, Chile, for a scheduled match. Along with the players were friends, family members, and supporters connected to the team. The flight was not unusual. Crossings between Uruguay and Chile occurred regularly, though the Andes presented known challenges. The aircraft lacked the power to fly directly over the highest peaks and instead followed a route that curved south through Argentina before turning west across a lower mountain pass near Planchon. This approach required careful navigation and reliance on timing, visibility, and communication with air traffic control. On October 12, weather conditions over the Andes were poor. Heavy cloud cover and turbulence delayed the westward crossing. The flight landed overnight in Mendoza, Argentina, waiting for conditions to improve. Passengers stayed in local hotels. The delay was inconvenient but not alarming. Flights through the Andes were often postponed during the transition between seasons. The next afternoon, October 13, the aircraft departed Mendoza. Weather reports suggested acceptable conditions along the planned route. The crew followed standard procedures, relying on dead reckoning navigation due to limited ground-based aids in the region. At the time, satellite navigation did not exist, and precise position estimates depended on wind calculations and elapsed time. As the plane approached the Andes, cloud cover reduced visibility. The crew believed they had passed the most dangerous section of the crossing. Based on their calculations, they reported to air traffic control that they had reached Curacao, on the Chilean side of the mountains. In reality, strong headwinds had slowed their progress. The aircraft was still deep within the range. Authorization was given to descend. The decision appeared routine. There was no indication of immediate danger, no warning alarms, and no unusual behavior from the aircraft. The passengers were seated, talking quietly, unaware of any navigational error. This journey existed because of sport, scheduling, and geography. It was a practical crossing undertaken many times before. The people on board were not explorers or adventurers. They were traveling to a match, expecting to return home within days. The Andes, however, allow little margin for error. Once the descent began, the flight entered a narrow space between ridges, where recovery options quickly disappeared. The descent began gradually. Outside the aircraft, cloud cover obscured the terrain. Inside, there was no visible sign that the plane was approaching rising ground. The crew relied on their instruments and prior calculations, believing they had cleared the highest peaks. The aircraft continued forward, losing altitude as instructed. Without warning, the outline of a mountain ridge emerged through the clouds. The pilots reacted immediately, increasing power and pulling upward in an attempt to climb. The aircraft responded slowly. At that altitude, with limited engine output and full passenger load, there was little margin for rapid ascent. The right wing struck the mountain first. It tore away instantly. The sudden imbalance caused the aircraft to spin. The left wing detached moments later. The fuselage continued forward, now unpowered and uncontrolled, sliding through the air before striking a slope covered in snow. The impact was violent but brief. The rear of the fuselage separated. Seats, luggage, and passengers were thrown forward. The remaining section of the aircraft skidded down the slope for several hundred meters before coming to rest in a shallow valley. Snow slowed the slide, absorbing some of the force. Of the 45 people on board, several were killed instantly. Others were seriously injured. The wreckage was open to the elements, with no intact insulation or functioning systems. The plane's nose was crushed. The cockpit had been destroyed. Silence followed. Wind moved across the snow. Loose debris lay scattered along the slope above. There was no fire. No explosion. The cold was immediate and persistent. Survivors began to assess injuries using what limited light remained. Many were in shock. Broken bones were common. Medical supplies were minimal, consisting of a small first aid kit intended for routine use, not prolonged care. There was no radio capable of transmitting distress signals. The emergency beacon had been destroyed in the impact. The location of the crash was unknown to those inside the wreckage and misreported to authorities based on the earlier navigational error. As daylight faded, the survivors faced their first night in the Andes. They were not yet aware of the duration they would remain there. At this stage, rescue seemed likely. Aircraft were expected. The assumption was that search teams would arrive within days. The environment offered no confirmation of this belief. The wreckage rested at approximately 11,000 feet above sea level, surrounded by snowfields and steep ridges. Movement away from the site appeared difficult, if not impossible. This moment marked the end of travel and the beginning of isolation. In the days following the crash, the survivors organized themselves around the remains of the fuselage. The intact portion of the aircraft offered the only shelter available. Seats were removed and repositioned to create a barrier against wind and cold. Luggage, insulation panels, and fragments of interior lining were used to close the open rear section. Snow was packed into gaps to reduce airflow. Temperatures dropped sharply after sunset. During the day, sunlight reflected off the snow, creating brief periods of warmth inside the fuselage. At night, the cold returned with force. Survivors slept pressed together to conserve heat. Clothing was layered and redistributed. Those with fewer injuries assisted those who could not move easily. Food was limited from the outset. The aircraft carried small amounts of wine, chocolate, canned food, and snacks intended for a short flight. Rations were divided carefully. Each person received minimal portions. The expectation remained that rescue would arrive soon, and conservation became the guiding principle. Water posed an immediate problem. Snow surrounded the wreckage, but melting it required heat. Survivors used pieces of metal placed in the sun to melt small quantities, sharing what they could. Dehydration was constant. Lips cracked. Skin dried and split. Breathing the cold air intensified fluid loss. Days passed with no sign of aircraft. Survivors climbed short distances up nearby slopes to look for rescue planes. Visibility varied. On clear days, the landscape appeared endless. On others, clouds closed in, reducing the world to a few meters of white. Radio news became a turning point. Using a small transistor radio recovered from luggage, survivors listened intermittently. After more than a week, they heard that the official search had been suspended. Authorities believed the aircraft had gone down elsewhere and that survival was unlikely. The announcement changed priorities. Rescue was no longer imminent. The group faced a decision not framed by urgency but by duration. Existing food supplies could not sustain them for long. There were no plants or animals at that altitude. Nothing grew. Nothing moved. The bodies of those who had died remained preserved in the cold. This fact was acknowledged slowly and without discussion at first. Over time, necessity forced a consideration that none had expected. The decision to use the bodies as a food source emerged through consensus rather than leadership. There was no ceremony and no debate recorded in detail. It was a practical response to an environment offering no alternatives. Routine developed. Snow was melted daily. Shelter repairs were made as materials shifted. Watches were kept for weather changes. Injuries were treated with improvised splints and rest. Mental focus narrowed to tasks. An avalanche struck in late October, burying the fuselage and killing several survivors as they slept. Those who lived dug themselves out, using hands and fragments of metal. Afterward, the group sealed the shelter more carefully and adjusted sleeping arrangements. Time became difficult to measure. Days blended together. Strength declined. Weight was lost steadily. Yet adaptation continued. The environment did not change, but the survivors' understanding of it deepened. They were no longer waiting. They were living. By early November, the survivors faced the cumulative effects of prolonged exposure. Frostbite had affected several individuals. Hands, feet, and noses were swollen and discolored. Respiratory infections emerged in the cold, poorly ventilated shelter. Injuries sustained in the crash, broken ribs, fractured limbs, concussions, worsened without proper medical care. Pain was constant, though it was moderated by the necessity of motion and routine. Food supplies dwindled. The small rations initially salvaged from the aircraft were exhausted. Snow provided hydration but no nutrition. The choice to use deceased passengers as a source of sustenance became regular, though calculated and methodical. Portions were measured, shared, and rotated to maximize survival. Those who consumed this food did so quietly. There was no ceremony, no celebration. The act was necessary, and the environment allowed no alternatives. Psychological pressure increased alongside physical deterioration. Survivors monitored each other, noting shifts in strength, alertness, and morale. Tension arose naturally, occasionally producing disagreements over rationing or movement. Confined spaces and constant cold contributed to irritability. Some individuals withdrew from conversation entirely, conserving energy for survival rather than interaction. Attempts to move from the wreckage were made. Groups ascended nearby ridges in search of valleys leading to inhabited regions. Efforts were largely unsuccessful. The terrain was steep and unpredictable. Snowfields concealed crevices. Climbers risked falls and injury. Return to the fuselage was always necessary, reinforcing its role as base and shelter. Weather continued to be an adversary. Snowstorms enveloped the area for multiple days. Winds exceeding 50 miles per hour reduced temperatures dramatically. Visibility dropped to zero at times. Sunlight returned intermittently, but short days limited warmth. Nights were long and unrelenting. The body's metabolic reserves were exhausted gradually, leaving individuals weaker but still functional. Several deaths occurred during this period, both from injuries sustained in the crash and from the effects of cold and malnutrition. The group adapted by reinforcing the shelter and adjusting routines. They maintained a rotation for monitoring the perimeter, tending to injuries, and melting snow. Decisions that would have been unthinkable weeks prior, such as rationing or calculating risk for expeditions across snowfields, became habitual. Time lost meaning. Dates were recorded when possible using available calendars, but awareness of day and night cycles faded. Those capable of movement marked passing days with minor tasks, collecting fragments of metal, reshaping the shelter, or distributing food. Others remained sedentary, conserving energy. The group's endurance was measured by small successes. Each day survived was a tacit victory against the unyielding environment. Each step forward, each rationed meal, and each repaired shelter section was a demonstration of adaptation. Loss, however, was constant and irreversible. The human mind and body were tested not by sudden catastrophe but by cumulative pressure. The environment imposed limitations that could not be overcome, only managed. Survival became a discipline, a quiet negotiation with altitude, cold, and deprivation. In late December, approximately 2 months after the crash, the survivors recognized that remaining at the wreckage indefinitely offered diminishing prospects. Food reserves were nearly depleted. Injuries and frostbite limited mobility, but some among the group retained sufficient strength for a controlled expedition. The decision was made to attempt contact with distant settlements. 2 survivors, Fernando Paradu and Roberto Canessa, began preparations for a trek. They studied the surrounding terrain during clear weather, noting ridgelines, valleys, and the relative slopes of snowfields. Clothing was layered, footwear reinforced, and small supplies taken from the fuselage. They carried no weapons, no specialized climbing equipment, only improvised tools and rationed food. On December 20, 1972, Paradu and Canessa departed the wreckage. Their path led westward, descending along steep slopes and crossing snowfields. Progress was slow. Avalanches had altered the landscape, leaving hidden crevices and loose rocks. Each step required caution. The altitude caused shortness of breath and rapid fatigue. Movements were deliberate, conserving energy for hours ahead. Days passed. Navigation relied on visible peaks and valleys, with sun position as a reference. The men rationed snow for water and shared small portions of remaining chocolate. Sleep was brief, often limited to a few hours under temporary snow shelters or rocky outcrops. Temperatures remained below freezing, particularly at night, and wind intensified exposure. After 10 days of trekking, Paradu and Canessa reached lower altitude where signs of human activity appeared: fences, cultivated fields, and grazing animals. They encountered a Chilean hueso, or local rancher, who observed their condition and immediately notified authorities. The survivors' location was recorded. The Chilean Air Force was contacted, and search teams were dispatched. Rescue operations proceeded efficiently. By December 23, authorities reached the remaining survivors at the wreckage site. The total number of those rescued amounted to 16. Many were severely malnourished, some with frostbite requiring amputation, and others with untreated injuries. Medical care was administered on site before evacuation. The process of evacuation was calm and methodical. Helicopters and ground vehicles transported the survivors to hospitals in Santiago. The rescued individuals were monitored continuously. Recovery was prolonged, but all received treatment for both physical and psychological effects. Documentation of survival, rationing, and injury informed medical personnel and investigators. The long walk undertaken by Paradu and Canessa had established the connection between isolation and external aid. It was a practical response to the realization that the environment, while passable, could not sustain the group indefinitely. Their trek represented a final, deliberate effort to convert endurance into contact and survival. The ordeal of Flight 571 remains a studied case in survival history. The combination of high-altitude exposure, isolation, and limited resources required extreme adaptation. Survivors relied on discipline, routine, and practical decision-making rather than improvisation or heroics. Daily life was measured in tasks: melting snow, repairing shelter, rationing food, and monitoring injuries. Human endurance in this context was defined less by physical strength and more by mental clarity under persistent stress. Each day presented the same environment, unchanged and indifferent. The Andes imposed limits on mobility, nutrition, and temperature, leaving no room for error. The survivors' methods, group cooperation, ration management, and observation of terrain, demonstrated how strategy could extend life in conditions otherwise unsurvivable. The historical significance lies in the unvarnished record of human survival. This incident illustrates the constraints of geography, climate, and chance. It also documents the quiet, measured responses required when conventional support fails. The lives preserved in this case were a result of careful assessment, endurance, and adaptation, rather than fortuitous luck. The Andes Plateau returned to its quiet state once the survivors were removed. The wreckage was gradually reclaimed by snow and time. The story left behind a detailed account of survival, endurance, and the human capacity to persist under prolonged environmental pressure. It remains a testament not to triumph, but to the steady, sober application of human effort against a relentless landscape.